Now to today's presentation, one of our members, a military historian, David Wilkins, OAM, who will be presenting on the 3 Vietnam Wars to 1946 to 1975. David graduated from the Royal Military College in Duntroon in 1963 and served with the 2nd Royal Australian Regiment, the Pacific Island Regiment and the 5th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, which was the last in Vietnam in 1969 and 1970, when he was both the adjutant, I think a Rifle Company 2IC and Rifle Company commander. He later graduated from the Australian National University, transferred to Army Legal Corps and was a Defence Force Magistrate and Judge Advocate for court martials. He retired from the Regular Army in 1986 and practiced as a barrister for 20 years and then as a tribunal member for the Veterans Review Board. David was awarded an OAM in 2019 for services to community history, in particular his most wonderful book that he edited, which is the history of 5 RAR, the Year of the Tigers?
Year of the Tigers.
Year of the Tigers, and also, with a number of others, the 4-volume, wonderful presentation, it really is a wonderful presentation, on the history of the men and women from the Ku-ring-gai municipality who served in the First World War. So without further ado, I now ask our speaker, David Wilkins, to present the lecture.
Thank you, Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, and should I say that Kathy Reith is here too, who was co-editor for those volumes that was mentioned by Paul. In 1965, an Australian journalist by the name of Donald Wise was visiting the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment at Bien Phu base, a big American base. He was spiffingly turned out in a brand new tiger suit of the South Vietnamese Marines. And as he approached the Australian compound, there were 2 diggers on guard there. One turned the other and, cocking a thumb at Don, said, "Geez, mate, we're saved. Bloody Tarzan's here to save us." Wise later told colleagues that he met the Australian Battalion Commander, Colonel Lou Brumfield, and was then flown by helicopter to a forward company. The CSM of the company took him in hand and towards the end of the day took him to a weapon pit and provided him with a blow-up mattress and a hoochie and mosquito net, blanket and some rations. And given his treatment, Wise couldn't believe reports the Australians were pretty antagonistic towards journalists and the media generally. "He did everything apart from tucking me into bed and kissing me goodnight," said Wise. At dawn the next morning, as the Australian troops were moving off on patrol, he overheard the CSM being questioned by a young officer. "Did you make Mr Wise comfortable and welcome, CSM?" "Yes, sir, we put him right out with the point platoon nearest the enemy like we do all those other bloody journalists." My talk today is about 3 Vietnam Wars. The first is the Indochina War from 46 to 54, known as the French War. The second, known as the American War from 60 to 73, and the third Vietnam War in 1975, where reunification occurred. Even though we refer to them as 3 Vietnam Wars, they are all connected. At the end, it's a big topic, so I will be skipping over quite a bit. In fact, John in the front here asked me beforehand if I was going to mention the Win sisters of the 13th century. Now, those 2 great warriors I won't be mentioning. We can't go that far back. At the end, I shall return, after discussing these 3 wars, to the main causes of the Second Vietnam War, and including things like the domino theory and so on. At the end, I hope there'll be time for me to take questions. But first, let's look at the geography. Indochina, comprising of Laos, Vietnam in pink, and Cambodia in mauve. Known generally as Cochinchina or by the French as Indochina. The French influence, there was, I should point out, I can't do it on the far map, some of the main cities that I'll be referring to. Hanoi, up there in the north. Hue, there, and Saigon, shown here as Ho Chi Minh City, of course. It changed its name after the reunification, down the south there. Bien Phu is just to the northeast. So they are the main towns and cities that I'll be referring to. The French influence in the area began in the 19th century, and for 100 years they brutally controlled Cochinchina, as they called it, which included those three countries. During World War II, the Japanese occupied Vietnam. See how we've jumped, John? Gone from the 13th century to the World War II so quickly. They occupied from 1940, the Japanese occupied Vietnam from 1940 until the end of the war. When the Allies were victorious, British troops and national Chinese troops moved into Vietnam to take the surrender from the Japanese. This created a hiatus for a short time, and the Viet Minh, which was the armed wing of Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam Independence League, were able to occupy Hanoi at the time, and in September of 1945 he declared an independent Vietnam. When the British and Chinese troops arrived, General Giap, G-I-A-P, General Giap, who was Ho Chi Minh's general, took the opportunity to seize control in Hanoi, but the French quickly recovered their position and re-established their authority over the main areas of Vietnam and gained control. What happened then was that the Viet Minh, who had been building up all the time, decided this was not good enough. They were going to oppose the French this time. Returning to the first Vietnam War, the first Indochina War between the Viet Minh and the French colonialists, that occurred from straight after the Second World War, from 1946 to 1954. Initially, the Viet Minh, there we have Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap. Initially, the Viet Minh used guerrilla tactics, but they stepped up the pressure in 1953, so much so that the French thought that they would have to have a showdown. They decided that the showdown would be by setting a trap in a valley town called Diem Bien Phu, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a major showdown there. Dien Bien Phu, where the red arrow right up in the far northwest corner of northern Vietnam. It was centralised in a valley surrounded by steep mountains. About 13,000 troops of the French Expeditionary Force, including Foreign Legion, Moroccan and Algerian regiments, strengthened their defences, knowing that the Viet Minh would never be able to use artillery from the rugged mountains surrounding these fortifications. They underestimated their enemy, however, and for 6 months the Viet Minh hacked precipitous tracks through the rugged and inhospitable mountainous area. They hauled their artillery to the mountain tops overlooking Dien Bien Phu Valley. Mass human wave assaults with artillery barrages from those mountain tops followed. Then a siege, and finally overwhelming attacks, which gave a decisive victory to the Viet Minh in 1954. As they were being overrun and annihilated, the French troops transmitted their last radio message from the Foreign Legion command post there. The enemy has overrun us. We are blowing everything up. Goodbye, our families. Adieu. That battle, that defeat, brought an end to the French rule. Under the Geneva Peace Accords, the French pulled out of Indochina permanently, and Vietnam was temporarily partitioned at the 17th parallel with a plan for unification to be decided by vote in 1956. What is shown there on the map as the Demilitarized Zone is the 17th parallel. To the north, in red, was the communist part headed by Ho Chi Minh, with General Giap as his military commander, and to the south of the 17th parallel was the basically non-communist part of Vietnam, ruled by initially Premier, later President, Ngo Dinh Diem. The election to decide if the North and South would be unified never occurred. First, the South argued that a free election was impossible under the conditions existing in communist-held territory. And secondly, the North believed that it could gain full control without an election because of the South's religious and military turmoil that was undergoing. So in breach of the Geneva Agreement, the North began a guerrilla campaign in the South where the Viet Cong, or South Vietnamese communists, supported by North Vietnam, conducted a campaign of terror, particularly by assassinations of government officials and murder within the village. In fact, that campaign led to the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands of South Vietnamese villagers and officials. The United States of America had been supporting the French colonialists and then South Vietnam with substantial military and economic aid since 1950. They reacted by introducing military advisors in 1955. US General Wilkins warned that the likely NVA military action would be conventional warfare like in the Korean War, where there was an invasion. So he erroneously advised the disbandment of South Vietnam's light infantry and divisions. Had these remained, they would have been better organised to oppose the eventual insurgent type as distinct from a major invasion type penetration through the outlying villages and regions. An important date here, ladies and gentlemen. The North Vietnamese Army, mainly at that stage by their main force cadres, began infiltrating into the South as early as 1959. Denied throughout the whole war and only revealed many years later. The Second Vietnam War, from 1960 to 73. In 1960, the Communist National Liberation Front, the NLF, was formed in Hanoi, the capital of the northern part, to direct all operations in the south, where it gradually took control of the regional areas in the south. The NLF was the political arm of the Viet Cong, or the Vietnamese communists, in the south. By 1961, the situation had seriously deteriorated, so the US advisors were assigned to South Vietnamese field units, not just to advise, but not to train, but also to advise and in some cases to lead in combat. By 1962, the number of US advisors and support personnel had escalated to 11,000. 1962 also being the year that Australia's first military advisors, 30 of them, were first deployed into Vietnam. Notwithstanding these efforts, within a few years the NLF boasted dominance over much of the South's countryside. In late 1963, within 3 weeks of each other, there occurred a coup d'etat in South Vietnam with the assassination of the very hated President Diem. And then, as I said, within 3 weeks, in the USA the assassination of President John Kennedy. Lyndon B. Johnson became the US president and was faced with a tough decision of whether to increase American involvement or to pull out altogether, while he could still do it. The deciding factor was the Tonkin Gulf incident of 1964, when the destroyer USS Maddox, conducting signals intelligence or SIGINT operations, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in international waters. Debatable about international waters. What's more debatable was the second of those two attacks, and it may have been instigated by the South Vietnamese, but we won't go into that because I don't know the details. This event on the high seas caused President Johnson, who in his announcements did exaggerate the event, to react dramatically, and retaliatory airstrikes were imposed upon North Vietnam. The NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, attacked villages and military outposts in the south, to which the Americans then decided to involve their own combat units. So we've gone from training team to training advisors leading South Vietnamese units, bombing in the north, and now American combat troops coming in to become involved in the fighting. At this stage, in fact, a bit earlier than this event, had commenced negotiations between America, South Vietnam and Australia for Australian combat units to be involved as well. Bombing of the north continued under Operation Rolling Thunder. We have there a B-52 bomber and a strike pattern of several B-52 bombers on the right. The noise of these and the ground rumbling and shaking was very much like an earthquake. By 1965, there were over 300,000 American troops stationed south of the 17th parallel. USA called for international assistance from its allies and received both logistically and combat troops. There were 30 nations who provided assistance, but only 6 provided combat troops: the United States, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia and New Zealand. The Australian contribution over the duration of the war, their contribution peaked at a bit over 8,000 in 1968-69, for a total of over 50,000 for the duration of the war. The maximum number of US troops in Vietnam at any one time was about 550,000, and that was in mid-1968. While South Vietnamese, they peaked at about 900,000 troops at one time. The war itself. Below the 17th parallel, or the Demilitarized Zone, or to use the American term, DMZ, below the DMZ were 4 core zones. The 4 core tactical zones, I Corps as they call it, 2 Corps, 3 Corps and 4 Corps. You will see in 3 Corps, that's Saigon down there, and in a later map I'll show you where the Australian base was in relation to that. Our enemy were mainly the Viet Cong, and that's their flag on the left, and North Vietnamese, or NVA, that's their flag on the right. The Viet Cong referred to itself as a liberation army. It was aimed at overthrowing the South Vietnamese government and unifying North and South into one nation. Despite the general belief in America and Australia, and indeed the world, most of the world, that it was a civil war in the South involving just the Viet Cong against the South Vietnam's government forces, it was in fact both VC and North Vietnamese armies fighting in the South. As I said before, the North began infiltrating in as early as 1959 and increased in greater numbers time and time again. And in fact, when I was there in 1959, 1970, we mainly fought North Vietnamese troops, or if they were Viet Cong units, they were stacked with North Vietnamese soldiers. Both Russia and China supported the Communist allies logistically, and recently it was admitted that Russian military advisors were also attached to some North Vietnamese units in the south, which explains why in one of our battles we saw opposing us, there was this tall Caucasian person. We couldn't understand it in those days, but we now know he was a Russian. Reinforcements and supplies for the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong in the south mainly travelled from China and North Vietnam through neutral neighbours Laos and Cambodia, and then across the borders into South Vietnam. Nothing to scale there, but as you can see, I've put in several entry points into South Vietnam, and you will see on this map the pink part down there, that is Phuoc Tuy province, and that is where Nui Dat base was, the Australians' base from which it patrolled and had operations mainly in this three-corps area here. Known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this network of routes was in parts like a multi-lane highway through the rugged mountains, and elsewhere just narrow jungle tracks with multiple entry points, as I've shown you. You'll see on the bottom right an early picture of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then it gradually got bigger and bigger, and by 1975 you had major highways. In fact, that's not a major highway, but they became multiple highways. In 1960, it took 6 months to resupply from North Vietnam into the middle part of South Vietnam through tracks like that. By 1975, which we will get to later, it took 1 week. The American and South Vietnamese Army troops operated throughout the whole of South Vietnam, from I Corps down to 4 Corps, but the Australian and New Zealand troops were mainly in 3 Corps in the area of Saigon and southeast of Saigon and other provinces apart from Phuoc Tuy province. That's Nui Dat base. All the areas here, that's a dam that our engineers put in. All that area around there was the Australian base. And when I wasn't on operations, that was my home. The enemy confronted by us was initially quite different from that encountered in more conventional wars. This was an enemy fighting as insurgents, who generally, but not always, avoided direct confrontation with Allied forces, preferring to be secreted away in its jungle and mountain hideaways and their tunnel complexes, to then launch hit-and-run offensives at opportune times. The Allied air superiority was the main reason for this, but at times they did launch major offensives against the large towns and cities in the south. As the war progressed, the NVA became more involved in conventional warfare, particularly in I Corps up near the DMZ, where its lines of communications were shorter to North Vietnam. In the Australian experience, examples only, examples of major direct enemy confrontation, apart from the battles in the jungles, occurred at the Battle of Long Tan, which you've all heard of, Fire Support Base Coral, Fire Support Base Balmoral, both of which were assaulted by North Vietnamese, and my own battalion in the village of Bien Ba. Here's some shots taken from that battle on the 6th and 7th of June 1969. This prisoner here only died the other day. He was one of the few who lived from that battle, because a large number of the enemy were killed in that battle. In I Corps, the US Marines were involved in both counter-guerrilla operations and conventional warfare. Major battles of the latter type occurred with tanks, infantry and artillery on both sides. Although the Americans had air supremacy there, the North Vietnamese Air Force did in fact challenge successfully at times the US bombers over Hanoi, and that's where a lot of the prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, were derived. But generally speaking, the American generals Harkin's and then Westmoreland's use of World War II type firepower and aerial bombing, a strategy designed to combat the modern Soviet threat in open warfare, was inappropriate for Vietnam. Westmoreland rejected a counterinsurgency approach. He rejected the British experience from the Malay Emergency, and French advice from the Indochina War was not sought. Don't know if anyone has read the book, thank you very much, Street Without Joy. And it really should have been a text for the Americans, but I don't think they read it. When the enemy did commit their large-size units to conventional battles, they were usually orchestrated to achieve maximum political gain and public relations advantage by coinciding it with an outside event, such as the US presidential or congressional election. By 1968, the South Vietnamese allies had reversed the tide and were winning most of the battles. And the VC and the North Vietnamese by that stage were sustaining huge casualties. On the other hand, the North was far more adept at swaying public opinion, effectively using public relations as a principle of war. There were too many major battles of the war to detail here, but one deserves mention: the Battle of Khe Sanh and the associated Tet Offensive of January that year, 1968. The US Marine base of Khe Sanh was located in a valley surrounded by rugged mountains. Sound familiar? It was eerily similar to Diem Bien Phu. It was close to the Laotian border in I Corps. It was established to cut off the North Vietnamese army incursions from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And on 21 January 1968, the base was attacked with massive artillery bombardment and a siege of the base by superior NVA numbers. Media coverage in the West reported that it was an NVA attempt to replicate the decisive French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Despite the battle continuing for several months, General Giap, the North Vietnamese commander, later denied this objective and said it was to draw American forces away from the populated areas so the Tet Offensive could succeed. Indeed, on 31 January 1968, just 10 days after this battle started, it did in fact divert American attention and troops from other areas when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated wave of assaults throughout South Vietnam, attacking major cities and provincial capitals throughout the length of the country. That is Khe Sanh up the top there with the blue arrow. The Tet Offensive was aimed at igniting a general uprising among the population of the south and defections from the ARVN, which are the main South Vietnamese troops, so as to topple the South Vietnamese government. The South Vietnam population, however, did not revolt, nor did any ARVN unit defect to the north. Instead, Tet was a military disaster for the north, which suffered huge losses. But on the other hand, it was a public relations victory for them, and it had a dramatic and lasting adverse effect upon US public opinion. The enemy not only surprised the Allies by launching these assaults on a Vietnamese national public holiday, but also succeeded in initially breaching the defences of many cities, including Saigon and Hue, before being repulsed. What impacted on the American public were the TV pictures in their lounge rooms of fighting in the city streets, at the same time being told by the press that the Khe Sanh battle was going to be another Diem Bien Phu disaster. See how the press and the media are huge in modern warfare. Hence my saying that the North Vietnamese cleverly used public relations as a principle of war. The Americans successfully held Khe Sanh and inflicted massive casualties on the enemy to claim a military victory there. But the combined effect of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive ordered the public opinion in America to sudden increase of casualties and uncertainty of an Allied victory, so that for the first time an absolute majority of public opinion was against America's involvement in the war. The public relations battle was being lost. It was a turning point in the war, despite the free world forces winning the battles. President Johnson lost his confidence in the military leadership and relieved Westmoreland of his command in mid-1968. And disillusioned by the sharp downturn of public opinion, he announced he would not seek re-election. When in 1969 the newly elected President Nixon announced a proposed end to the US involvement and the reduction of its fighting troops in 1970, other Allied nations were initially resistant to it, but later did follow, including Australia. Optimistically, this was on the basis of the success of Vietnamisation, which was a planned program of building up the South Vietnamese forces so that they could look after themselves without American involvement. Optimistic, but when Nixon announced this policy, he said that America had a change of policy. Instead of America always doing it themselves, it was now time for them to teach, even though they had trainers there earlier on, but now teach the Vietnamese and build them up so that the South Vietnamese could control the battles themselves. Peace negotiations were occurring at the same time. You remember the name Dr. Henry Kissinger. He was involved in those peace negotiations between North Vietnam, South Vietnam and the USA. This finally led to the Paris Peace Accords being signed on the 27th of January 1973. This was a time, remember, that the Allies were winning the battles. The North was winning the public relations. Nixon was saying to his public, don't oppose what we're doing in Vietnam because that will strengthen the North Vietnamese position in these negotiations. Get behind us. They didn't. Nixon called it a peace with honour. That peace treaty ended the Second Vietnam War. Allied operations ceased. The US combat troops departed within 2 months. But controversially, Henry Kissinger allowed in the negotiations to be part of the terms. The North Vietnamese units were allowed to stay where they were. It was now for South Vietnam to protect themselves against any future enemy. Prisoners of war were released on both sides. The South Vietnamese President Thieu had been most reluctant to sign the accord, but was assured by President Nixon and his negotiator Henry Kissinger of continued US support if North Vietnam breached the treaty. Kissinger promised, quote, a swift and brutal response, unquote, by the US if there was a major violation. Nixon also promised to continue aid in the form of $1.6 billion. And remember, this is many years ago. It was a lot of money. But that was an empty promise, not by him, but by Congress, who only allowed a portion of that money to be spent. When President Ford took office in 1974, he also made an unfilled promise of assistance if required. Within no time, the North and South resumed fighting. As well, from 1973 to 1975, in the absence of US troops, the North Vietnamese Army made preparations for finishing the war, including by upgrading the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They again utilised the trail to position troops and equipment in readiness. And as I said before, what took 6 months initially now was beginning to take far less, like 1 week. In December 1974, in direct breach of the Paris Peace Accords, the NVA conducted a test attack into central Vietnam to see if the US would in fact become involved. President Ford said, and the US Congress said, there would be no more support from the US. This stunned President Thieu and delighted Le Duan, the Secretary General of the Vietnamese Communist Party in the North. With no US support being offered, the North proceeded with its plans for a major invasion. That occurred on the 10th of March 1975, 2 years after the peace negotiations, or the peace treaty. It began in the Central Highlands, the North having calculated that the liberation of the South would take 2 years. In fact, it took less than 2 months. That was despite courageous efforts by some of the South Vietnamese units. But as Australian Colonel Ted Sarong later said, South Vietnam simply ran out of bullets. The refugee exodus was massive, and within weeks the South was in retreat. The towns and cities fell like a row of dominoes. There had been neither intervention nor support by the US. There was no peace and there was no honour. By the 20th of April 1975, they had surrounded Saigon, having taken the major military location of Xuan Loc, where the South Vietnamese fought courageously. Within 10 days, Saigon was taken, and that's a tank of the North Vietnamese Army crashing through the palace gates. On that same day, Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. That was a photo taken by Neil Davis, an Australian war correspondent, who was in the palace waiting for it to happen. Historians and the media have generally recorded that America lost the war, but that is not accurate. There was an agreement to stop the fighting, a peace treaty, and the Allied departure was in compliance with those peace terms, at which stage the military situation in South Vietnam was vastly improved from the dire straits of the early 1960s. Although 3 years after the treaty there was a military victory by the North over the South, it is inaccurate for the media and people to say that North Vietnam defeated America. The USA were not there. They may not have won the war, but they did not lose the war. Politically, they lost. Militarily, they didn't. But the social consequences in the South were vast initially for those non-communists in the South. Under the Marxist regime, there followed years of economic depression, famine, revenge executions, and brutal re-education camps that followed, together with desperate exodus of the non-communist Vietnamese. In fact, over 2 million people fled the homeland, many as boat people. Evacuation to Australia at the time of the end of the war, because we still had, of course, an embassy and troops guarding the embassy, but that's all. Evacuation to Australia of South Vietnamese nationals who worked at the embassy and in the military headquarters in Saigon was attempted, but the new government, the new Whitlam government, disgracefully, in my opinion, refused to approve it and inhumanely abandoned that plan. Instead, they sent pacifying communiques to Hanoi. Conversely, in the month of April 1975, the Americans rescued 65,000 Vietnamese. And today? Today's Vietnam is a unified, independent and relatively economically stable communist nation. Any concern about communism in Asia is not there. It now focuses on the huge development economically and military of China. It is China and its apparent policy of expansionism that is causing most concern. Ladies and gentlemen, I can see that I'm running out of time, so what I shall do is I'll show you a few slides and I won't discuss them in detail. We'll now turn to the causes of the Second Vietnam War, arising from initially the North's desire for reunification against the non-communist South, and then after the Second World War, the arms race, the Iron Curtain, the Truman Doctrine. I'll show you some. There's a good example of the effect of the division of nations in Europe of the Iron Curtain. This was a term phrase caused by Sir Winston Churchill. As a result of those various events that caused there was a huge fear of communism and the building of Soviet communism and Chinese communism. The Ho Chi Minh had, by this stage in 1951, forced the national Chinese out, and they had retreated to Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek. Alliances were made in both East and West, and both ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and CETO, the 8 nations of CETO in Southeast Asia, both of those alliances were part causes for involvement of Australia in the war. The domino theory, very quickly, that is a diagrammatic effect of the domino theory, but it began with President Dwight Eisenhower saying, you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. Can I say, for those people of my own generation, I recall that at the time in the early 1960s, there was a real fear of the Third World War occurring, with Soviet Union and Communist China being the main antagonists. And that Third World War was going to be nuclear. Australia really did fear, and America did fear, communism spreading further south. That was the domino theory. It was poo-pooed at the time by those opposed to the war, but in part it was a truism. There was a spread of communism through the south very quickly. It included the Pathet Lao in Laos that came to power in 1975, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot controlling Cambodia from 75 to 79. You had the PKI in Indonesia, and there are communists in the Philippines also. So it was a real fear. Our involvement in the war was questioned. Were we invited? Did we invite ourselves? Were we ingratiating ourselves with the United States? We had always relied upon Great Britain, the UK, but after the Malaysian emergency, again against communists, in 1960, the Brits withdrew. Australia was nervous, so they turned to America. And that's part of the reason, a major reason, why Australia became involved in supporting the United States in Vietnam. Initially, our advisors, however, went to South Vietnam at the request of President Diem. Our combat troops, I'm still not so sure whether that was involving South Vietnam's president at the time, President Chiu, I think, or whether it was just between Australia and America talking, and that's what led to Australia's involvement. I think I better stop there and take questions.